There was a man named John Mullen who lived in Cashen and worked at the local school, digging sand. Every morning, like clockwork, John set out for work at around 7 a.m., walking the same familiar road. One morning, as he made his way to the school, he spotted a woman coming toward him. At first glance, John could tell she was a stranger, but what caught his eye was how well dressed she was, a bit unusual for someone walking down that road so early. John, with his shovel and pick slung over his shoulder, prepared to greet her as they approached each other. But just as he was about to speak, the tools slipped off his shoulder and clattered to the ground. Startled, John bent down to pick them up, and when he straightened back up, the woman was gone. He looked around in confusion, scanning the road and the surrounding area, but she had vanished without a trace. That's when it hit him. She must have been a fairy woman. Standing there, trying to make sense of what had happened, John noticed something glinting on the road where the woman had been walking. It was a shilling and sixpence. Surprised, but not one to waste a gift, John pocketed the coins and went on his way. The next morning, as he walked the same road to work, there it was again, another shilling and sixpence, lying in the exact same spot. John picked it up, just as he had the day before, and continued on his way. This curious pattern repeated for 4 mornings in a row. Each time, he found another shilling and sixpence, and each time, he tucked the money into his pocket with a growing sense of wonder and excitement. By the 4th day, John couldn't keep the strange occurrence to himself any longer. That evening, he went home and told his wife about the mysterious fairy woman and the coins that kept appearing on the road. But the next morning, when John eagerly walked down the road, there was nothing waiting for him. The coins were gone, and they never appeared again. Whether it was the fairy woman's doing or a strange twist of fate, John would never know. All he was left with was the memory of those 4 days and the peculiar fortune that had lined his pockets. There was a young boy whose mother and father had both passed away. Left without his parents, he went to live with his grandmother in a small cottage in the district. When Christmas came, they had almost nothing, just a single loaf of bread for their Christmas dinner. They had no money to buy anything else. But on that morning, a fairy appeared at the door of the old woman's cottage, playing a flute. The fairy said to the woman, "I am very hungry." Feeling pity for him, the woman handed over the loaf of bread, their only food, and the fairy ate every bit of it. After he finished, he said, "You have been good to me, and I will be good to you. Send the boy out at midnight to the back of the house, where the ash tree stands." When midnight came, the grandmother nervously sent the boy out to the ash tree. There, under the tree, stood the fairy, but he was not alone. The boy saw many other fairies gathered there as well. The fairy who had visited the cottage spoke only a few words. Then, he handed the boy several pieces of gold and sent him back to the grandmother's cottage. With the gold, the pair went into town the next day and bought food, clothes, and all the things they needed. From that moment on, they lived comfortable lives for the rest of their days. There's a fairy tree on a golf course in Belfast that's been there longer than anyone can remember. This ancient hawthorn tree was already standing when the club opened its doors in 1893, and it's believed to have been planted long before that, possibly centuries ago, as hawthorn trees can live up to 400 years. Out of respect for its history and the folklore surrounding it, the club's gardeners don't trim or touch the fairy tree. Visitors to the club are advised to nod to the tree as they pass, as a sign of respect. And if someone happens to hit the tree with a stray golf ball, they're encouraged to apologize to it right away. It's a small tradition, but one that keeps the fairy tree's mystique alive for everyone who visits the course. In my district, there was a wishing well believed to belong to the fairies. It was said that anyone who visited this well while the dew was still on the grass and made a wish would have their desire granted by the fairies. There was once a teenage girl who visited the well each morning for 7 mornings. Each time, she took 3 drops of the well's water while the dew still glistened on the grass. But on the 7th morning, she never returned home. No one knew what she had wished for, and no trace of her was ever found. The people of the district believed the fairies had taken her away. Since that day, the place where the well is located has been known as the Fairy Glen, a name that preserves the mystery and wonder of the story to this very day. In Clifton, there once lived a very good and holy priest. Though his flock was small, they were faithful, and he cared deeply for them. The priest was an old man when this story took place, but he still had a horse to take him from place to place. One night, he received a sick call. A dying man needed him, and he quickly set out on his horse, riding 7.5 miles to reach the man's home. He made good progress until he came to a ditch at the top of a cliff. There, his horse stopped and refused to take another step. No matter what he did, the animal wouldn't budge. Suddenly, out of the darkness, the priest heard a beautiful voice. It was singing a well-loved song called, "A Pretty Girl Milking Her Cow." The voice was enchanting, and the priest found himself mesmerized, unable to move, listening for a full 20 minutes. Then, all at once, he remembered the dying man. Snapping out of his trance, he urged his horse forward and rode as fast as he could. But when he reached the house, it was too late. The man had passed away. From that day on, the old people in the district refused to let anyone sing that song. They believed the fairies had claimed it and used it that night to delay the priest, preventing the man from receiving his last sacraments. And so, the song remains untouched, a reminder of the fairies' influence and the mystery of that fateful night. There was a boy named John from this district, and he came from a large and respectable farming family. One day, something strange happened. John disappeared, and no one knew where he went. 4 years later, 2 of John's brothers were walking near a thorn bush not far from the house when they heard a strange cracking sound. It startled them so much that they ran straight home. That same day, their mother heard a footstep near the house and said to her daughter, "If John were here, I'd swear that was his step." Not long after that, John came back to the farm. He told his family he'd been with the fairies all this time. He asked his brothers if they remembered the crack they had heard, and when they said yes, he explained that it had been one of the fairies. John said the fairy had shot an arrow at him, and in an attempt to stop it, he raised a plate to block it, causing the strange cracking sound. When his mother asked about the footsteps she had heard, John said it was his, and that he had been nearby the whole time he was gone. He could see everything they were doing, even describing in detail the day they took corn into town. But when they asked how he had been taken by the fairies, or how he had been released, John couldn't explain. He only said it felt like he'd been unconscious for a long time, then suddenly woke up in this world and came straight back to his family. There was an old, poor man from County Donegal. When he passed away, only 2 people showed up to his wake. The 2 men sat quietly, paying their respects, when around midnight, something strange happened. A sudden blast of fairy wind blew right through the door. All the candles around the man's body went out, and for what felt like 5 minutes, the men couldn't move. They just sat there in silence, unable to do anything. Then, just as suddenly, the candles lit back up, but the man's body and coffin were gone. The men later said that the old man had wished to be buried in a particular place, but his grave had been prepared somewhere else. They wondered if that was why the fairies had taken him. After that night, the coffin and the man's body were never seen again. A few years ago, out on the Erin Road where the minister lived, there were fairies. Every night, they would come out and play around a certain group of trees. One early morning, the minister was passing by and decided to stop and watch them. As he stood there, one of the fairies approached him and asked what he was looking at. The minister replied that he was just admiring the small fairy dresses. The larger fairy was not happy with this answer. He told the minister to move along and never bother them again. But the minister didn't listen and kept standing there, watching the fairies. Then the fairy warned him that he would suffer bad luck for his actions. The minister ignored the warning, turned around, and went home to tell his wife about the encounter. He went about his day, but that night, he suddenly became ill and died soon after. His wife always believed that if her husband had just walked away when the fairy told him to, he would still be alive. 2 old men, Peter Mean and Con Clark, lived in Cashard. One night, they were on their way to visit a neighbor's house. The path they took was known to be a fairy path. As they made their way home late that night, it became pitch dark. Peter decided to turn back and get a coal carrier from their friend's house to help light the way. While Peter was gone, Con stood waiting on the fairy path, but after a while, he began to hear voices, like people talking. Thinking it was Peter returning with a group of men, Con started walking slowly, expecting them to catch up. The next thing he knew, he found himself standing at the top of a turf stack on a hill. At first, he was confused, not knowing how he had gotten there. All around him, he could hear murmurs of conversation. Finally, Con called out, "I never did anything to you, so take me home." In the blink of an eye, he found himself back in his own garden, safe and sound. One night, a teenage girl in Newfoundland left a party and decided to take a shortcut through the woods on her way home. But she disappeared for 2 whole days. When she was finally found, she didn't have any memory of being missing. However, her coat was missing a few buttons, and there was a big bruise on her leg. As days went by, the bruise became swollen and painful, so much so that the doctor had to operate on her leg. Inside the wound, the doctor found some twigs, mud, and the missing buttons from her jacket. There's a fairy blackthorn bush near a fort in Sligo, a place shrouded in mystery and legend. A man once dreamed, 3 nights in a row, that a box of gold was buried beneath that very bush. One summer morning, around 2 a.m., he decided to see if the dream was true. He started digging and soon hit a large stone. Just as he thought he was making progress, he heard strange noises. Turning around, he saw the entire field behind him filled with red pigs, their eyes glowing in the dim light. Terrified, he fled back home. The pigs followed him all the way. Not long after that, he left for Australia, never to return. To this day, the hole he dug under that fairy tree is still there. No one has dared touch it since. Once, in Hodestown, County Meath, there lived a woman who wasn't known for her good sense. One day, while out in the fields, she came across a banshee, sitting and combing her long, silvery hair. Without hesitation, the woman walked right up to her. As soon as the banshee saw her, she vanished, leaving her comb behind. The woman, eager to keep it, picked up the comb and took it home. That night, there was a knock at her window. It was the banshee, calling for her comb. The knocking continued for 3 nights, growing louder and more desperate. A neighbor advised the woman to give the comb back but warned her not to hand it directly to the banshee. On the 3rd night, when the banshee appeared again, the woman used metal tongs to hold the comb and carefully reached it out the window. The banshee took the comb but snapped the tongs clean in half before disappearing into the night. The woman never crossed a banshee again. There was a certain family in Ballinstack that the banshee always followed. One time, a boy from that family went to America. Not long after arriving, he fell seriously ill. One day, as the rest of the family worked in the fields, they heard the banshee crying from the next field over, wailing all day long. That night, as they sat around the fire, a shadow passed by the door carrying a bag in its hand. Later, they learned that the boy had died that very night at that very time. Near the ruins of an old house by a fort in Castlemore, 4 brothers named Martin, Pat, Michael, and Tom lived. They were all pipers, and it was said that their musical gift came from the fairies. One night, the eldest brother, Martin, was coming home from town. Feeling tired, he rested on a bridge near the old mill and fell asleep. When he awoke, a beautiful fairy stood before him and asked him to play the pipes for her. He refused, and she vanished without a word. After that, Martin found he could no longer play his pipes. His gift had vanished, and he was devastated, as he earned his living playing at parties and gatherings. A week later, Martin was passing the same bridge and, once again, fell asleep. The fairy returned and asked him to play for her, this time handing him a new set of pipes. He agreed and played better than he ever had before. From that moment on, Martin never lost his gift again. In the parish of Garton, a man named Ned Ward opened a quarry near his house, employing a number of men to help. On the first day of work, a little fairy appeared and warned Ned to leave the quarry or suffer the consequences. The men ignored the warning and continued working. That night, Ned returned home to find his healthy daughter suddenly struck dumb. She remained that way for the rest of her life. However, the girl developed a strange gift. Whenever anyone in the house lost something, she could walk directly to where it was. Though the fairies had taken her ability to speak, they had given her this unusual ability in return. She lived to be 28 years old. A teenager from Durham accepted a dare to ride his bicycle around a quarry known to be a fairy dwelling. On his 9th lap, a swarm of fairies appeared and attacked him. Panicked, the boy rode home as fast as he could, but the fairies followed him all the way. As he reached his front door, they threw a javelin at it, leaving a mark. There is a fort near Lard, about a mile from Kilconnell, where people believe a fairy is seen holding a light at night. By day, it is said to take the form of a hare. One day, some men decided to capture the hare. They chased it all day with their dogs, and the hare, though injured, escaped into the fort. The men followed and found an old woman sitting on a stone, smoking a clay pipe. The woman asked one of the men to come closer and handed him the pipe. As he took it, she said, "You are saved now, and so am I." Then, she disappeared and was never seen in the fort again. In Kilmore, there are 3 forts on my uncle's farm. One of them has a big cave in the middle, surrounded by bushes and briars. People feared passing by it, let alone entering. One day, my father and his 2 brothers ventured into the cave. At first, they saw nothing, but as they went deeper, they found a fine road underground. They followed it until their lantern suddenly went out, plunging them into darkness. Terrified, they stumbled back out of the cave. No one has dared explore it again. One night, my uncle was walking near the same fort when he heard the bushes rustling. Suddenly, a white calf leapt out, let out an awful roar, and disappeared back into the fort. As my uncle turned to leave, he saw the calf again, this time with white horses following it. He heard voices saying, "If he doesn't leave now, he never will." He hurried away and never went near that fort again. A woman in the district once heard a hammering sound while milking her cows. Curious, she went to investigate and found a leprechaun working by a ditch. She caught him in her apron and demanded he tell her where gold was buried. The leprechaun slyly pointed to her house and shouted, "Look, it's on fire." When she turned to look, he escaped and ran away. By the hospital lane, the fairies are said to travel each evening from the hill to the sea and back. One night, Mrs. Abney, who lived in a cottage at the sea end of the path, left her door open, expecting her son. A tall man entered and sat by the fire. When Mrs. Abney asked, "In the name of God, who are you?" the man stood and said, "Never leave the door open at this hour, or evil may come to you." Then, he vanished. Her husband, upon hearing the story, calmly replied, "One of the good people has been with us."
Remember to like and subscribe so you don't miss the next set of tales from the other side. Submit your story to the email below. And remember, nothing is what it seems.